They neglect their ailing father and found out after he passed that he had changed his will and left everything to the caretaker. In the heart of Atlanta, an aging widower named Elijah Porter lives out his final years in quiet dignity, forgotten by the very children he once sacrificed everything for. As his health fades, the only soul by his side is Lorna Hayes, a devoted caretaker who treats him with the love his own blood has long withheld. But when Elijah dies and his will is read, a storm of betrayal, greed, and truth shatters the Porter family forever. What unfolds is not just the story of an inheritance, but a haunting revelation of who truly loved and who merely waited to inherit. Welcome to African Stories by Asada, the Cynic Driver's YouTube channel. Where are you watching from? Before we dive into the story, we encourage you to rate the video and tell us in the comments below where you are watching from. Please, like, share and subscribe to the channel so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up. Elijah Porter sat in his aging Atlanta home, sunlight filtering through the curtains his late wife, Delilah, had sewn 15 years ago. His children, Marcus, Danielle, and Tyrone, rarely called anymore. The silence in the house echoed louder than any noise could. Only the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the gentle shuffle of Miss Lorna Hayes, his caretaker, reminded him he wasn't completely alone. Lorna had been with him for 12 years, cooking his meals, managing his medication, and sitting with him through lonely nights. She called him Mr. Eli, with warmth in her voice, and he'd smile in gratitude. Yet every time the phone rang, he'd hope it was one of his children, some sign they still cared. Too often it wasn't. The calls came only when they needed something, never to ask, "Daddy, how are you feeling today?" And each passing season made that truth cut a little deeper. Marcus, the eldest, had once promised to check on his father every Sunday after church. Elijah remembered how proudly Marcus had carried his firstborn son through the front door years ago, introducing him to Granddaddy Eli. But the years faded those visits away. Marcus grew busy with his own life, a demanding job, and a sense of resentment toward the old man who hadn't been able to help him through his last business failure. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored. Sometimes, Elijah would dial his son's number, listening to the ringing fade into voicemail. "Hey, it's Marcus. Leave a message." Elijah would hang up before speaking. Lorna noticed the quiet ache in his eyes afterward. She'd bring him tea, trying to fill the void his family left behind. "You raised them right," she'd remind him softly. Sometimes people forget what love looks like when they start counting dollars instead of memories. Danielle had moved to Chicago years earlier, pursuing a career in marketing. She was the glamorous one, always talking about the next promotion, the next vacation, the next upgrade. Her father's health updates became inconvenient interruptions. She'd tell Lorna on the phone, "I'll come down soon. Maybe next month," though the next month never came. Elijah would still polish the guest room furniture before every promised visit, just in case. Dust gathered anyway. Danielle sent holiday cards signed only with her name, no calls, no visits, just embossed signatures and glittering ink. When Lorna mentioned how much Elijah missed her, Danielle's tone cooled. "He's in good hands. That's why we pay you." The words stung. Elijah never heard them himself, but Lorna did, and she guarded his heart from their sharpness. Still, each Christmas, Elijah kept a plate set at the table for his daughter, hoping maybe one day, she'd walk through that door again. Tyrone, the youngest, had drifted farthest from home, physically and emotionally. His struggles with consistency mirrored his life. New jobs, new girlfriends, new excuses. He dropped by every few years with empty promises to spend more time, Pops. But the visits were brief, filled with nervous laughter and glances at his phone. Elijah wanted to believe his son's good intentions. He'd offer him food, ask about his work, try to connect through sports or old family stories. Tyrone would nod politely, but his eyes were always somewhere else. When he left, the house felt colder. Lorna watched Elijah fold his trembling hands, whispering prayers she could barely hear. "They're my babies," he'd murmur, as if convincing himself. She understood loneliness. She'd cared for many elders, but none had clung to hope like Elijah Porter. He refused to accept that love could fade just because time, or greed, had taken hold of his children's hearts. The neighborhood remembered Elijah as a proud man, retired from the postal service after 35 years, known for his spotless lawn and warm wave. But age had slowed him, and without Delilah's laughter echoing through the halls, the house had grown weary. Lorna became his steady companion, filling in where family should have been. She learned how he liked his cornbread crisp, his jazz low, and his Bible open to Psalms each night. The children, though, seemed untouched by nostalgia. Marcus didn't come for Father's Day. Danielle forgot his birthday. Tyrone once texted, "Love you, old man," but didn't follow up. Elijah pretended he didn't mind. "They're busy," he'd say. But deep down, he knew busy was an excuse. It wasn't distance that kept them away, it was disinterest. And every time Lorna tucked a blanket over his knees, she wondered how children could abandon a man who had given them everything he had. There was a quiet dignity in how Elijah handled neglect. He never complained to the neighbors, never spoke ill of his children, even when his health began to falter. Lorna was there through hospital runs, endless medication schedules, and the slow decline of memory that sometimes left Elijah confused about days and names. But even in his fog, he never forgot Delilah. "She'd be disappointed," he said once, tears in his voice. She'd say, "Eli, you can't force love out of folks who don't know how to give it anymore." Lorna held his hand that day, feeling the tremor of a man who'd been strong too long. The walls of the house seemed to sigh with him. The pictures of his family stared down like ghosts, 3 grown children who had once called this place home but now existed only in framed smiles and faded school portraits gathering dust on the mantel. The loneliness grew heavier with time. Elijah's body weakened, and Lorna became more than just a caretaker. She was his confidant, his surrogate family. She knew his rhythms, the way he tapped the armrest while thinking, the sigh that meant pain was creeping in. "You're like my daughter," he once told her, eyes glistening. "Only difference is you show up." Lorna smiled through tears. She didn't want his gratitude, she just wanted him comfortable, respected. The children called occasionally, short, distracted conversations about trivial things. None of them asked about his doctor's visits or mounting prescriptions. When bills came in, Lorna organized them. When the lights flickered, she handled repairs. Elijah had savings, investments even, but his children's absence spoke louder than any financial statement. To them, he was a bank account waiting for withdrawal. To Lorna, he was family deserving care and dignity. And she gave both without question, day after day. The seasons passed, dogwoods bloomed, summers baked the sidewalks, and still, the Porter children stayed away. The house grew older, creaking with each rainstorm, but Lorna kept it alive. She trimmed hedges, cooked Sunday dinners for one, and read aloud from Elijah's favorite newspapers. Sometimes she'd read letters he had written but never sent, pleas to his children to visit. The ink had faded, the words trembled with pain. "My hands can't write much anymore," he'd say, "but maybe if they saw it in my own handwriting, they'd remember." Yet, the letters stayed sealed in his drawer, like silent prayers never delivered. Lorna once asked why he didn't mail them. Elijah smiled sadly. "I already know the answer I'd get." And so, he spent his last years surrounded by memories of people who had long stopped remembering him. Only Lorna remained, a steady light in a home dimmed by neglect and lost affection. By Elijah's 82nd birthday, the house had become more museum than home. Dust motes danced in sunlight through faded curtains, and the smell of antiseptic mingled with the faint scent of magnolia from Lorna's perfume. She organized a small celebration, just a cake, his favorite jazz record, and a card signed, "With love, your family in spirit." He smiled weakly when she presented it, pretending the words came from his children. In truth, Marcus had forgotten again. Danielle's text arrived 2 days late. "Happy belated birthday, Dad," and Tyrone didn't respond at all. Elijah's eyes misted over the candlelight. "You shouldn't have gone through the trouble," he murmured. "You deserve it," Lorna said softly. She took pictures, though he didn't know why. Maybe they'll want to see these someday. But deep down, she doubted it. Some absences stretch too long. Some love, when neglected, hardens into something you can't resurrect with photos or apologies. Winter came harsh that year. The old furnace struggled, and Elijah caught pneumonia that nearly claimed him. Lorna stayed awake 3 nights straight, nursing him with soup, blankets, and quiet hymns. She'd sit beside him, whispering prayers, her hands clasped around his frail ones. "You should call your children," she told him once. "They'd want to know." He shook his head gently. "They'll just feel burdened." When Marcus eventually found out, weeks later, his response was brief, glad he pulled through. No visit followed. Danielle sent a bouquet that wilted before Elijah saw it. Tyrone texted Lorna to ask if his father's insurance was still active. That question broke her heart. She didn't tell Elijah about it. Instead, she read him scripture, letting him drift into sleep with peace instead of pain. To her, his children had already lost something more valuable than any inheritance. They'd lost their chance to love him while he lived. The local pastor, Reverend Caldwell, often visited Elijah to pray. He noticed what everyone in the neighborhood already whispered, how the Porter children had vanished from their father's life. "Sometimes God sends angels in ordinary clothes," the pastor said one evening, nodding toward Lorna. "You've been that for him." She smiled humbly, but the truth weighed heavy. She shouldn't have been the only one there. Elijah's mind wandered more frequently now, confusing past and present. "Delilah," he'd call softly, reaching out to empty air. Lorna would take his hand, playing along. "I'm right here, Eli." It comforted him. The children called on holidays but stayed only long enough to update him about their lives. New houses, new cars, nothing about him. Lorna often wondered how they justified it to themselves. Perhaps they thought their absence was harmless, that love could wait. But Elijah's time was running out, and they didn't seem to notice. The day Elijah fell and fractured his hip, Lorna was alone with him. She called the ambulance, rode beside him, and waited through surgery. Not one of the children appeared at the hospital. Lorna called them, 3 voicemails, 3 unreturned messages. "Maybe they're busy," Elijah whispered from his hospital bed, his voice weak but forgiving. Lorna wanted to cry. She watched as he clung to excuses that protected his children from blame. "They'll come," he kept saying. But no one did. Days turned into weeks. Lorna brought him home, setting up his room with medical supplies and gentle light. She fed him, bathed him, prayed with him. Sometimes, when he looked out the window, she knew he was searching the road for a familiar car that never arrived. The loneliness pressed in like humidity, thick, suffocating, and constant. Still, Elijah smiled every morning. "You're my blessing," he told her. And she quietly vowed never to leave. When neighbors asked about his children, Elijah always smiled. "They're doing well," he'd say proudly, deflecting pity with dignity. He'd never let anyone know how deeply their absence hurt. "They got their own lives," he'd add. "I'm happy for them." But Lorna saw the truth, how he kept their childhood drawings tucked under his Bible, how he stared at the phone after every cough, hoping for a call that wouldn't come. On Sundays, he'd hum gospel hymns alone, filling the house with faith to drown out emptiness. The children sent no visits for years now. The Porter house, once alive with laughter, had turned into a quiet shrine to what family used to mean. Still, Elijah's faith remained unshaken. "God knows my heart," he told Lorna. "He'll judge them fairly. Not with anger, but with truth." And as the sun dipped low behind the Atlanta skyline, his words felt more like prophecy than hope. Elijah began writing letters again, this time addressed to each of his children. He wrote not out of anger, but farewell. The letters were tender and aching, full of forgiveness they hadn't earned. He wrote of their childhoods, the first bike rides, scraped knees, bedtime prayers. "You were my joy," he wrote. "But somewhere, you learned to measure love in money, not time." He sealed the envelopes, gave them to Lorna for safekeeping, and asked her to deliver them when he was gone. "Maybe then they'll understand," he said softly. Lorna nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. He spent that night watching the city lights flicker through the blinds, murmuring Delilah's name like a prayer. In his mind, he wasn't angry anymore. He was tired. And when he finally closed his eyes, a small peace came over him, the peace of a man who'd given love without condition, even when it wasn't returned. In Elijah's final months, his decline was swift but gentle. The doctor said his heart was giving out. Lorna knew it had simply been broken too long. The children never saw him again in person. Marcus sent money for his comfort. Danielle promised to visit after her big project. Tyrone's number disconnected. The world had moved on without him. Lorna remained faithful to the end, reading scriptures, singing softly, and making sure he was never alone. When the end came, it was quiet. Elijah took her hand, whispered, "Thank you," and slipped away as dawn brushed light across the room. Lorna sat there for hours, tears soaking her sleeve, feeling the ache of loss that didn't belong only to family. Somewhere in the city, his children continued their routines, unaware that the man who had loved them beyond measure had taken his final breath without hearing their voices one last time. A month before his passing, Marcus showed up unannounced for the first time in years. Lorna was cautious. Visits from the children always meant something. Marcus came dressed sharply, eyes darting around the home like he was assessing it. "Pop, you look good," he said, though his father's frailty was obvious. After a few minutes of pleasantries, Marcus revealed his purpose. His construction business was in trouble. He needed a loan to get through a rough patch. Elijah, heart swelling with fatherly instinct, agreed to help. He withdrew $5,000 from savings, hands trembling as he passed it over. Marcus promised to repay him soon. He never did. Lorna saw the disappointment hidden behind Elijah's tired smile afterward. "He's my son," Elijah whispered. "Maybe he just needs a break." But she knew the truth. Marcus came for money, not love. The visit ended as quickly as it began, leaving behind silence and regret. Danielle's calls were always calculated, wrapped in affection that felt rehearsed. "Daddy, how's my favorite man?" she'd begin before easing into her real reason. She needed help with her mortgage this time, something about a rough quarter at work. Elijah, ever the provider, didn't hesitate. He wired her the money, smiling proudly. "You know I'm always here for you," he said. But when Lorna mentioned how lonely he'd been, Danielle brushed it off. "I'll visit soon," she promised, voice already distant. The visit never came. Lorna tried not to judge, but it broke her heart watching Elijah give pieces of his savings away to children who gave nothing back. "She's doing her best," Elijah said, defending her even as his checking account dwindled. Lorna bit her tongue, knowing the truth. His kindness was a currency they kept exploiting, one withdrawal at a time, until nothing remained but his faith in them. Tyrone's visits were the most unpredictable. He'd show up late at night, nervous, smelling faintly of cigarettes and desperation. "Pops, I hate to ask," was always how it started. His stories varied: car trouble, overdue rent, a bad investment. Elijah never said no. Even when Tyrone's excuses grew thin, he offered what he could. "You're still my boy," he'd say softly. One evening, Tyrone asked for help starting a business venture. Elijah handed him $2,000 from a drawer Lorna managed for household funds. When Tyrone left, he didn't look back. Lorna found Elijah crying quietly at the kitchen table. "He's lost," Elijah said. "But lost things can still be found." His hope was heartbreaking. Lorna knew some people never found their way back, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to face what they'd left behind. Sometimes, the children called each other to coordinate their requests, pretending it was about helping their father manage his estate. Marcus would ask Danielle if she'd checked in, and Danielle would say she was handling the finances. It was all pretense. They each assumed Lorna had access to Elijah's accounts, so they treated her like a gatekeeper. "Can you ask him if he still has those bonds?" Danielle once asked. Lorna's polite refusal drew thinly veiled irritation. "We just don't want him taken advantage of," Marcus added, a bitter irony that made Lorna's stomach twist. They weren't protecting their father, they were circling him like creditors. Elijah overheard once, sadness clouding his face. "They think I'm blind," he murmured. "But I see them, Lorna. I see who they've become." His voice cracked with grief, not anger. He still prayed for them each night, proof that even betrayed love can't stop loving. The final time the children came together was 6 weeks before Elijah died. Marcus had called a family meeting, but the agenda was money. They gathered in the living room, Marcus pacing, Danielle scrolling her phone, Tyrone nodding at everything. They wanted Elijah to consider liquidating some investments to help them all get ahead. Lorna sat quietly, feeling her blood boil. Elijah listened without judgment, though his hands trembled. "I worked for 40 years, he said softly. "I think I've earned the right to rest in peace without counting pennies." His words fell on deaf ears. When they left, the air in the house felt heavier than ever. That night, Elijah told Lorna, "They'll be fine when I'm gone. I just hope they learn what wealth really means." His tone carried the quiet resolve of a man who had made a decision none of them would see coming. The burial and revelation. Elijah Porter's funeral took place on a gray morning in southwest Atlanta, the kind of day where the sky seemed to mourn with the living. The church pews filled mostly with neighbors, friends from the Postal Union, and members of the congregation who remembered his steady smile. Lorna sat in the front row, dressed in a modest black dress, holding the folded handkerchief Elijah had once carried to every Sunday service. Marcus stood stiffly beside Danielle and Tyrone, their faces composed for appearances. They hadn't cried. The pastor spoke warmly about Elijah's humility, his faith, and his unwavering kindness. "He was a man who gave love freely," Reverend Caldwell said, "even when it wasn't returned." Lorna's throat tightened at that. Danielle dabbed her eyes, though her gaze drifted toward the casket more with guilt than grief. The hymn rose softly, "His eye is on the sparrow," and for a moment, it felt as though Elijah was finally at peace. After the burial at Greenwood Cemetery, the family gathered at Elijah's house. Lorna had prepared light refreshments, just as he would have wanted. The living room felt hollow without him, his chair empty, his slippers still by the fireplace. Neighbors offered condolences and quietly left, leaving only the children and Lorna. Marcus poured himself a drink, pacing impatiently. "We should probably contact the lawyer," he said. Danielle agreed quickly, her tone clipped. "Yes, we need to get the estate settled. Dad had a lot of assets, investments, property, the house." Lorna said nothing, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She already knew Elijah's wishes. He'd spoken to her weeks before his death, eyes steady, voice resolute. "You've been my family," he told her. They had their chance. She tried to dissuade him, but he insisted. Now, as Marcus dialed the attorney's number, Lorna felt the weight of what was coming, the storm Elijah had predicted. The will reading took place in the conference room of Harper and Young law firm downtown. The mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, and tension hung thick in the air. Marcus leaned forward, Danielle crossed her arms, and Tyrone slouched nervously. Lorna sat quietly at the far end, her eyes downcast. Mr. Young, Elijah's attorney for over 2 decades, began with solemn professionalism. Mr. Elijah Porter, being of sound mind, left behind a final testament dated April 3rd of this year. He paused briefly. The siblings exchanged curious looks. None remembered any discussion of a new will. "He requested that I read this aloud in its entirety." As the words filled the room, his blessings, his gratitude, his reflections, Lorna could almost hear Elijah's voice. He thanked each child by name for the joy they once brought him, then spoke of how love is proven by presence, not promises. The air grew still as Mr. Young reached the final section. "Upon my passing," the lawyer read, "I bequeath my home, my savings, and all investments in full to Ms. Lorna Hayes, whose loyalty and compassion have sustained me through my final years." The words seemed to freeze the room. Danielle's mouth fell open. Marcus straightened abruptly, eyes wide in disbelief. Tyrone whispered, "What?" as if saying it would undo the reality. "To my children," the lawyer continued, "I leave my love and my hope that they rediscover the meaning of family." Silence followed, heavy and unrelenting. Danielle's voice broke first, sharp, trembling with anger. "That woman manipulated him." Marcus slammed his hand against the table. He wasn't in his right mind. Lorna sat motionless, hands trembling, eyes wet but unyielding. Mr. Young met their fury with calm. Mr. Porter underwent cognitive evaluations during this time. He was fully competent. The siblings exchanged shocked glances, realizing this was no mistake. It was a deliberate choice. The outburst came fast and loud. Danielle accused Lorna of deceit, of taking advantage of their father's weakness. Marcus threatened to contest the will. Tyrone muttered curses under his breath, pacing in disbelief. Lorna said nothing. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but unwavering. "He loved you. Even when you weren't here." That silenced them briefly. Mr. Young handed each of them a sealed envelope. "Your father wanted you to read these privately." Danielle tore hers open first, scanning the words with shaking hands. Her breath caught halfway through. Marcus hesitated, then unfolded his own. Tyrone followed suit. Each letter was written in Elijah's careful script, the same notes he'd penned months before. They weren't filled with reproach, but remembrance, stories from childhood, lessons about love, forgiveness without condition. By the time they finished reading, none could meet Lorna's eyes. Their anger began to dissolve, replaced by a gnawing shame. The drive back to Elijah's home was quiet. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. Danielle stared out the window, mascara smudged from tears. Tyrone scrolled aimlessly through his phone, though the screen blurred in his vision. When they arrived, the house felt foreign, as though it now belonged to another world, one that no longer included them. Lorna stood in the doorway, ready to say goodbye. "He didn't want to punish you," she said softly. "He just wanted peace." Marcus nodded stiffly, unable to speak. Danielle opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, Tyrone looked her in the eye. "You really took care of him, didn't you?" She nodded. "I did. Every day." He lowered his head. No one argued anymore. The bitterness had burned out, leaving only the quiet realization that they had been absent from the man who had never stopped loving them. Weeks later, Marcus returned alone. He found Lorna tending the garden Elijah had once loved. "I came to say, I get it now," he said quietly. "We weren't there. You were." She smiled gently, eyes tired but kind. "He forgave you, Marcus. That's all he wanted, to be remembered as someone who gave." He looked at the house, at the porch where he used to sit with his father as a boy. "I thought he'd always be here," he murmured. "So did I," Lorna whispered. Before he left, she handed him a small box Elijah had set aside. Inside was a pocket watch engraved with, "Make time count." Marcus held it like something sacred. That night, for the first time in years, he called his siblings, not to fight, but to talk. Elijah's absence had finally done what his presence could not, bring them back to one another, however fragile the reunion might be. On a warm spring evening months later, Lorna visited Elijah's grave. The sunset spilled gold across the headstones, and the air was alive with the sound of cicadas. She placed fresh flowers beside his marker and whispered, "They're trying, Mr. Eli. They're coming around." Her voice carried the tenderness of gratitude and grief intertwined. She looked toward the horizon, remembering his laughter, his quiet dignity, his faith. The inheritance he left her wasn't just wealth. It was trust, born of years of care and shared humanity. Behind her, the Porter children had begun visiting the grave occasionally, leaving notes and tokens of remorse. Time was mending what neglect had broken. As Lorna walked back toward the car, she smiled through her tears. Elijah Porter's love hadn't died with him. It had simply changed hands, resting in the hearts of those who had finally learned that real inheritance is measured not in money, but in love. Moral lesson: love is not proven by words or blood, but by presence and compassion. True family is not defined by shared names or inherited wealth, but by the hands that lift you when you can no longer stand, and the hearts that stay when others walk away. The Porter children mistook inheritance for entitlement and kinship for convenience. But love cannot be withdrawn and returned like a favor. In the end, Elijah Porter's final act was not betrayal, but justice wrapped in mercy. He rewarded loyalty where it was given and exposed neglect where it hid behind excuses. His will became more than a document. It was a mirror, reflecting the truth of who loved him for his worth, not his wealth. Money fades, but devotion endures. What you give in love is the only legacy that never dies. Thanks for watching. Please leave comments, like, share and subscribe so that you will be the first to be notified of our next video coming up.